Good morning, everyone. Pleased to welcome you to today's Future Flight Standards webinar. I'm Nick Fleming. I'll be your chair for today's session. I'll shortly be running through our agenda for today and introducing you to our speakers. We have a few minor changes to the agenda. I'll explain. I'm just looking at the numbers there on the top right-hand side. So we currently have 65 people. You can see the little totalizer there moving up. And hopefully that will get a bit higher as we go. But I'll make a start anyway in the interest of time. And what I wanted to do briefly was just talk about the aims of today's webinar before I move on to the housekeeping type bits that we always need to do in these online events. But because you've joined a Future Flight webinar, I'm going to make an assumption that you'll be mostly familiar with what was being referred to as future flight. So here we're talking about air mobility, advanced air mobility, use of future flight technologies, and obviously the UKRI Future Flight Challenge that many of you will be either involved in or aware of. However, for those who aren't working immediately in this area, and hopefully we do have some of the wider community on today's webinar, what we're talking about today really is the potential for innovation in the aviation sector, and that's coming from emerging technologies such as digital and automated systems, electric and hydrogen power, and these enabling new and novel aircraft, whether that's advanced drone systems, electrical vertical takeoff and landing craft, and the potential here is that this may promote new forms of mobility, better use of airspace, the movement of goods, services, and obviously people through between cities and regionally too. This, of course, has to be done safely, not only to build confidence amongst the industry, but with regulators, investors, customers, and the wider public. So this will require not only proving the concept of this technology across various use cases and through R&D programs, including the Future Flight Challenge, but also will be very much depend on investment into the sector, regulation and standards. And we want to use today's webinar to take that focus on standards and our standards program supported by UKRI to provide some context around it, including the regulatory landscape, signposts to where we might be able to help you, and highlight some of the opportunities for you to get involved. This morning we have an expert panel to help us do that. We hope to unpack this a bit more in terms of some of the areas where some of the areas and opportunities for standards, some of the barriers to getting future flight technologies to market, operationalized, commercialized safely, and what role standards alongside those other instruments I've mentioned, such as regulation, can play in helping to achieve that. This is very much around BSI's program, understanding where standards can add value. And we think standards can play an important role in supporting innovation and emerging technology. So we'll explain more on that shortly. So I'll move on to the obligatory housekeeping now, if we can. So one of the things about this webinar, this platform we use, which is a little bit different to platforms you may have used before, is this is a listen-only webinar. This means you won't be able to turn your cameras on or unmute yourself. Only our presenters and speakers can do this. However, we do want to ensure the event is as interactive as possible. So please submit your questions via the chat function, which is located. You should be able to see that on the kind of top right-hand side of the sidebar. And we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can, and also look out for any links that we post in the chat to things we're talking about today. So just moving on to the agenda, if we can. We've got a full agenda today, and we've had to make a few changes to it, as I've mentioned. So we don't have Ava Gowers from the CAA with us today, unfortunately, due to some technical issues on our side, so apologies for that. However, we do have a wealth of regulatory knowledge and experience from across our panelists. So Today we're going to hear from Gary Katz, Challenge Director Future Flight at UKRI. We'll also hear from BSI's own Chris G, our Head of Air Mobility and the Future Flight Standards Lead. We'll then hear from Mike Gadd, who's currently Head of the Office of Airworthiness at Blue Bear Research Systems. Mike's also Chair of ACE20, BSI's Technical Committee, which looks at drones and UAS. And then we'll also hear from Nicola Bates, who's Head of Global Innovation and Accelerator Programs with Boeing, amongst other things. And I'll introduce each of our speakers properly when we get to them. So what we'll do is we'll hear from each of our speakers. Some will have presentations and slides, and others will just provide general comments. And then we'll move into a Q&A type panel session where we'll field your questions. So before we introduce our first speaker, I just wanted to spend 5 minutes or so on a bit of background to BSI and the role of standards before we do that. So if we could move on to my first slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So hopefully many of you will be familiar with BSI and what we do. BSI is the UK's national standards body, and we develop national standards such as the PAS and the FLEX, British standards. We are also a member of international standards organisations such as ISO and IEC, and the European standards bodies CEN and CENELEC. How we work in that area is our technical committees very much represent UK interests through the development of European and international standards, and BSI adopts and draws down those standards for the UK. This is very much a two-way street, and many BSI standards have become the basis of international standards, including something like 7 or 8 of the 10 best-known management system standards. But BSI is also a group of businesses, and we have a global footprint. We're a world-leading certification and testing body, and probably many of you will be familiar with the Kite Mark. And you'll no doubt be familiar with our management system standards as well. For those of you close to standards or who work with standards regularly, you may notice a number of standards bodies logos that are very, very common in aviation and not on this slide. The likes of SAE, ASTM, UKRI, who I know are a kind of quasi-standards organisation. So I think that's a kind of disclosure really, and some of our work in the Future Flight Challenge has really been to understand the standards landscape, agnostic, if you like, of the standards bodies. So we're looking across all of the standards bodies. We recognise the importance of the work of all standards bodies. I think what we're trying to do is A, help make sense of this landscape, and B, going forward, look for opportunities to promote cooperation and harmonisation across these different standards bodies as we can. So some of our work in support of the Future Flight Challenge has been very much around mapping that landscape, understanding it, and looking at where there are common gaps across the landscape. And Chris will talk to some of this later. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So if you're familiar with standards, and hopefully many of you are, you'll be familiar with the potential benefits of standards and their relationship with regulation, although this is sometimes less clear. So we feel there's lots of potential benefits from standards away from regulation, and these include quality, improving performance, quality management, safety and risk management. Increasingly, really, we're seeing a drive around sustainability and the role that standards can play in supporting a move towards decarbonisation of our transport sector. But standards are distinct from regulation. They're developed separately, but they can very much complement regulation, and in some areas even fill a potential void while policy and regulation develops. But what we see generally is that standards have this opportunity to provide an alternative means of compliance to regulation, or a means of some form of compliance to regulation. But but we're very much trying to emphasise here, slightly decoupling, that they are separate instruments, but they're complementary. For example, you probably wouldn't regulate the particular technical specification of a ground charging unit or a cable or a socket, but regulation could call up a standard that does that or highlight its use. Standards can be designated as well by industry. Probably a good example of this would be the standards around sustainable aviation fuels, or SAFs, with the ASTM standards there. So we know that they are designated standards. So there may be standards for testing SAFs, but their use, or from a policy or regulatory perspective, would be the role of a regulator. Also, a big driver for standards is the supply chain, of course, and confidence across the supply chain. One area where we're increasingly seeing standards having a role is supporting this early stage innovation, and that's particularly potent where perhaps regulation is emerging itself and little is known around the technologies and their capabilities and the risks. And standards can be a really neat way of actually getting industry, academia, research, and other stakeholders, including government, around the table to start to set down what good looks like. I think there's a role that standards can play very, very well. How the standards are developed also differs. Standards are developed through very much an open, consensus-based process that includes a full public review, and so in that sense, standards very much represent good practice. It's not always natural to think of standards and innovation in the same kind of sentence, but we think the key here is about developing the right standards at the right time. And what I've done, if we can move on to the next slide, please. What I've done here is use the kind of well-trodden TRL ladder to help us do this. I appreciate this is a little bit of a complex slide, but what we thought this would help with is really illustrating the role that standards can play across the evolution of a technology, whether that's digital technologies, new low carbon fuels or fuel system technologies, whatever it might be. I think the TRL ladder here, it's possible most future flight technologies and businesses may be sitting somewhere in the middle of the scale, at this level of starting to look at demos, demonstrators and prototypes, and not quite yet at full commercial deployment level, but nearing it perhaps. And so if we apply, say for instance, if we use BV loss as our example here, in the early stages of BV loss, thinking about how we make that change towards beyond visual line of sight operation. In the early stages, the type of thing you could standardize may be language and vocabulary, and that actually can be very powerful if you're trying to talk about the capabilities of technologies in a consistent way. We've seen that in lots of different areas. As the technology starts to develop, what we've seen again is the potential to talk about the operating environment may require the likes of taxonomies. As the technology develops, we may feel that there's opportunities to start to carve out that guidance. Okay, what does good look like? That could be, for instance, the development of guidance for safety cases. What should go into a safety case? What is proportionate in terms of safety? And it may be some time before we get to the stage of being able to start to pin down hard and fast technical standards. But the work we do early stage is very much a precursor to those. A bit later, I'll jump back out of the agenda and spend just a few minutes talking about work we've done in a similar domain from the connected and automated vehicles area, where we've been developing standards in a largely unregulated space, but hopefully, helping to support policy and regulatory thinking as well. Just finally on this slide, I think the other thing to pull out is something we're seeing across all emerging technologies, which is the potential to adapt standards from other markets and other sectors, so the big kind of grey bubble at the bottom there. One thing we've seen in future flight, and we've also seen it in areas like maritime and others, is that where standards don't exist, engineers are looking to the next best thing, and looking at what exists out there that they can make use of, from automotive or road, for instance. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to use that, not reinvent the wheel, but maybe the focus then becomes understanding how we adapt those standards for the aviation domain. I'll leave it there for now, and we'll move over to our speaker sessions. So I think our next slide, please. So I've already introduced our speakers, but we'll now move into our sequence of speaker talks and presentations, and we'll start with Gary Cutts. So I'd like to hand over to Gary, our first speaker now. Gary, please feel free to switch your camera on, although I realise I haven't done that myself. So Gary leads the UK government's Future Flight Challenge programme, working across industry and government. The Future Flight Challenge is one of the UK government's programmes executed by UKRI, and its aim is to demonstrate how new and integrated aviation can utilise new technologies, including low carbon and autonomous technologies. Gary has vast experience in the aviation industry, working with Rolls-Royce, amongst others. And hopefully, Gary, you're able to set the context a bit for us by providing a policy perspective, but also an overview of the Future Flight programme. So, Gary, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Nick, and hopefully everyone can hear and see me perfectly. So if I can jump to the first slide, please. So this morning, 10 minutes is quite a short amount of time. I've said many times in this challenge, future flight does not lend itself to an elevator speech. It's such a broad thing. But I want to do two things this morning if I can. One, to talk a little bit about the Future Flight Challenge itself. Many people online will know quite a lot about it, but not everyone, so I think it's important to set context. But more importantly, I want to talk about the things we've learned across the last 4 years about developing this electric distributed aviation system. So Future Flight itself, Future Flight is a UK government programme, a challenge, £300 million nominally, although in reality it's created much more investment than that, but a £300 million programme to bring 3 classes of new types of air vehicles to the market: drones, air mobility, and electric or hydrogen regional mobility vehicles, conventional takeoff in the last case. But it is not an aircraft programme, it's an aviation systems programme. We're working with industry, academia and other bodies in order to create that integrated new aviation system. The slide in front of you is one taken from the vision and roadmap we published a few years ago. It points out the 3 classes of vehicles there and how we see them and what they are. But this slide is really talking to the benefits and use cases. And that's really, I guess, where our heart is. We all come from an aviation background. We are fascinated by, and we love the technology, the 3 pictures at the top. But really for us, the Future Flight Challenge is about what you do, how you execute new modes of mobility and logistics. And I would say this is anything but a technology drop-in. If people occasionally refer to things like advanced air mobility as electric helicopters, that is a massive misunderstanding. That pretends that we're doing all the things we used to do and we just have a new power system in this. It is much more than that. It's creating new use cases, a new set of benefits, whether that be about better consumer choice, improved logistics, reducing congestion, but it's all fundamentally about better connectivity and green at birth. So if I jump to the next slide, please. So the approach that we've taken throughout the challenge has really had 3 central strands to it. Number 1 is that we think this is about demonstration. It's about learning by doing. So creating challenging real world use cases for these new forms of aviation, exercising the system, bringing the system together and learning how its codependent nature works. The second thing is absolutely about convening industry. We could spend a long time on this, but when I came into this job, we had lots of technical activity going on in narrow buckets, and we've seen this real power of bringing together people from across the entire ecosystem. I'm not going to walk around that picture. There's not nearly enough time to do this today, but I would say for most people, the ecosystem is much wider than what they first think of. It takes in a range of activities, and they're not all technical. It takes in communities, publics, it takes in local authorities, national government, the role of standards and regulation and ecosystem development. So that second phase is really important to us, bringing the entire system together. That fits very well with the remit of BSI in setting standards across the patch as well. And the very last point for us, and one that we think has differentiated Future Flight from some other activities, we've always had this people-based focus. You'll detect that in everything we say. This is about providing benefits to people, but also reassuring people who see this as somewhat scary, somewhat intrusive, this new form of transport they don't fully understand, that's got a load of technical dependency on things like AI and autonomy. How do we bring those people along with us and get this kind of social desirability language rather than just public acceptance? So those three things are really central to us in how we see the challenge. And if I jump on to the next slide, please. So for us, and I've used this slide quite a lot, I've titled it, "It's Closer Than You Think." That probably depends on your perspective. We have some people moving very fast who think that the thing should be even quicker than this. But generally, for the average person, when you talk to them, they have a really kind of response to everything we do in Future Flight. It's not so much understood how near the technologies are, how fast they're coming, and how much change they will introduce in society. So for us, we think there's an important message here that this thing is closer than you think. I'll talk a little bit about Future Flight. So we set up our challenge in 3 phases. I've talked about the first phase, which was this kind of co-creation discovery phase, bringing the community together and indeed discovering who the community was that has to create this new ecosystem. We went through that in 2020 through to 2022. Then we had a second phase around technical development, funding and developing some of the underpinning technologies and some of the relationships between the different technologies. Now we are entering the demonstration phase 23 and 24, where it's really important that we take these things and we start to do the first meaningful public challenging use cases of them. That's really important to us. We get early application and we discover. Now, a really important theme, and I'll come to it on my last 2 slides as well, so no apologies for emphasizing this. This system is not a classic deterministic systems engineering problem. It's not one where you can write down a problem statement and a perfect set of requirements and have a single architect at the top, decide how to architect the system, cascade it down via a work breakdown structure and all those systems engineering artifacts, and just design the system and validate it. It is not like that at all. It's a highly complex, emergent, divergent system. So no one can sit above and architect it. And that's a really important theme for us, which, as I say, I'll come back to on the last 2 slides. The system itself is, it is still diverging to some degree. We're still discovering things. We don't understand all the technical solutions. And we're certainly learning how these different facets, be it the air traffic management system, the sensing technology, and the social acceptance, how do those things fit together? But the whole thing is moving at an immense pace. So you're trying to bring a divergent, complex ecosystem towards demonstration. How you do that, it's a real juggling act, and the standards are a really important part of that, the right standards at the right time. Just a final note before I move to my penultimate slide. For the Future Flight Challenge, I've cut the slide out for time, but we are funding 17 real game-changing, socially important projects. And for us, they are game changers. They're really ambitious, and they all come to demonstration in late 23 or 24. So I won't run through all the projects, but that includes for medical logistics and beyond. So we're moving quickly to the demonstration phase of things. The public will start to engage with this strongly. So if I jump to my penultimate slide, please. Sorry, hopefully you can still get me. Thank you. Excellent. So a quick run through of the kinds of things we're doing. And again, I don't want to walk through all of this, but this is a really useful demonstration from last year through to next year, some of the things that we see as a government challenge that we have to do. And this is, you know, a mere snapshot. The work we've done in the past includes, Nick mentioned some of this, some of the early thinking about the safety case framework, what are the main facets of the safety case. we've done an awful lot of early work on the public attitudes, public engagements in the bottom left. I'm speaking to you from the University of Birmingham, where we lead our social science research program from, and that's been a real eye-opener. The social sciences as a mechanism to design an aviation system, that's quite a thing. And you get the idea from all the other things on here, what we need to do. And BSI and the program of standards absolutely sits at the heart of that. So the main point I want to get across from this slide is all of those activities, they are codependent and contemporaneous. I hope that's not too much of a mouthful, but they really are codependent.
We've lost you again, Gary, but let's just hang on because we got you back last time. I think we may have lost Gary there.
We come back to that in the Q&A, but that will be really important. The public will rely on standards and regulation for them to get the confidence to give the social license for this system to go ahead. So that that dependence is a really important facet. And if I just jump to my last slide, please. So hopefully the final slide will summarize everything I've said, if I manage.
You are breaking up a little bit now, Gary, but we did make it to your final slide, and I think the content of the previous slides was fantastic. So I think we've managed to basically understand what you were trying to get across. I think we might have lost Gary now. So what I'll do is, while Gary is kind of re-establishing his contact,
many startups, many tech entries. And for us, it's, it remains a safety critical system, so that what we're trying to do is balance two competing things: immense speed, a number of new entrants, and a system that's going like crazy, but it is an immensely complex ecosystem that we need to convene at some point. So standards play a really key role in, as I say, the right standard at the right time to knit all of that activity together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary. Thanks very much for that. We were losing you a little bit there, but I think we got most of your slides through and most of your presentation, but you were breaking up a little bit towards the end. But it was a really, really helpful introduction and to the Future Flight Challenge. And I think some of the things you pulled out there feel really important. The public perception and the people-based focus, as you've said, understanding the different stakeholder views, including through the standardization program, which I think is obviously part of what BSI does. I think the other thing that struck me is your presentation really highlights how the Future Flight Challenge and the standards program is going to help to understand how this technology will work in the real world, which I think is really helpful, and we can perhaps pick that back up in the Q&A. But thank you, Gary, for now, and we'll hopefully be able to restore your connection for the Q&A session. So I'd like to invite our next speaker now, which is Chris G. So Chris G is Head of Sector for Air Mobility at BSI, and he's also, more relevant for today, the lead on the Future Flight Standards Programme. So Chris is leading on BSI's work, government, regulators, industry, to understand the role of standards and to shape the standardization activity as we look to commercialization, industrialization of the sector. Prior to joining BSI, Chris worked for Connected Places Catapult, leading a range of their air innovation, innovative air mobility programs. And Chris, you're going to provide us with a bit of an overview of the BSI program, the standards we are developing, and touch upon how people can get involved in that. And I guess critically, the work we're doing around the BSI roadmap to address gaps in the future flight standards ecosystem.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and good morning, everybody. So as Nick mentioned, I'm the lead for the BSI Future Flight Standards Programme, which I'm going to talk through today for a few minutes. So our programme is sponsored by UKRI as a cross-cutting piece of work, And we're using this to understand how standards can accelerate safe development and industrialization of the sector. We can move on to the next slide, please. Thanks. So I just want to start with a bit of background and context as to why we're delivering the programme and how standards can support the sector and the UK's position internationally. So through the programme, we want to support and accelerate safe trials and demonstrations over the next 18 months of future flight. And I'll talk later about some of the standards that we're developing to be able to support that. Secondly, there's strong evidence from other industries like telco that standards can help commercialise and industrialise emerging sectors such as future flight. We also want to identify opportunities where standards can help underpin the UK as a centre of excellence, building on existing expertise. And then finally, through the relationships with ISO and CEN that Nick mentioned earlier, we want to be able to influence the international development of standards. And this will enable us to support interoperability and harmonisation internationally. So to help us remain aligned with these objectives, we have a strategic advisory group for the programme. This has broad representation from industry and also from the government and the CAA. Next slide, please. The programme is split into three main areas shown on the slide here, and I'll just run through each of them in a little bit of detail. So the first one is landscape and roadmap. So we released the Future Flight Standards landscape in April. This was the first iteration so that we could start to have a debate and engagement with industry. And the purpose of the landscape is twofold. Firstly, it's a useful tool for industry to understand what standards are available. And secondly, it provides a baseline for the programme that we can then use to help us develop the roadmap. We recognise that we can build upon this first version of the landscape, so we're working with industry to release an updated version in autumn. We'll use this updated version of the landscape to understand where there are real gaps in standards, and this will be used to inform the standards roadmap that we deliver in spring next year. We're working with DFT and the CAA to ensure that the roadmap aligns with the UK's Future of Flight Action Plan. So that's the overall sort of strategic direction for the UK around future of flight. So our roadmap will show how standards development will support the UK strategy overall for future flight. The second area is the community hub. So standards development is all about convening stakeholders and building consensus. The community hub provides us with an additional way of engaging industry to understand the challenges where standardisation can help. We're also using the community hub as a collaboration tool to get real-time feedback on the standards that we're developing for future flight. And that's working really well, and probably it's the first time that we've used that tool on a standards development process. So we're sort of innovating in the way that we're developing standards as well as the innovation in future flight. The Community Hub also provides an opportunity for industry to engage in discussions and debate around sector challenges and how standards can help. I'll provide details at the end about how to access the Community Hub because there's a wealth of information there that's useful for the sector. As part of the programme, we're also developing an initial 4 standards. We've been through a robust process with industry and government and also the regulator to prioritise the standards that we develop. Later in the summer, we'll release our new vocabulary standard for public consultation. We're also currently initiating a further 2 standards and starting a research project. Next slide, please. So this is the a sort of static version of the standards landscape. So if you haven't actually seen the live version of it, it's a visual interactive tool that enables you to drill down into categories and subcategories of standards. It was a bit difficult to be able to segue in and demonstrate the tool live on the webinar. However, this slide provides an overview of how you can navigate the landscape to pick a category and a subcategory. So in this example, we've drilled down to look at the standards available for UTM, so uncrewed traffic management systems. The landscape includes over 200 standards. I think the important thing here is we've not just built on British standards or ISO standards. You know, we've pulled in all the major aviation standards organisations. So That includes ISO, ASTM, SAE, RTCA, and UKRI. So the example shown here is an ASTM standard. And you can see at the bottom of the dialog box is actually a link. And if you click on that link, it'll take you off to find further information about that particular standard. So the intention of the standards landscape is to provide a single lens into relevant standards for future flight, rather than people having to navigate the complexity of multiple standards organizations. So this landscape is available on the Community Hub as one of the tools that we provide. Next slide, please. I'll now walk through the 4 areas of standardization that we're delivering through the program. So the first standard we're developing is a vocabulary to support future flight. As Nick mentioned in his introduction, at the lower TRL levels, standardizing vocabulary has significant benefits. It provides a common language across the sector and avoids confusion. And this is particularly important in a safety critical environment like future flight. This standard builds upon existing vocabularies, and the first iteration has a particular focus on more complex and crewed operations. Subsequent iterations of the vocabulary will cover broader aspects of future flight. The vocabulary will be out for public consultation shortly, so please do get in touch if you'd like to be notified when this happens. The next standard we're developing is an operational design domain. Operational design domains, or ODDs, originated from work on connected autonomous vehicles. And this was where it was important to have a way of describing the environment in which a trial could safely operate. So an ODD provides a framework and taxonomy to enable operating environments to be codified and described in a consistent way. There's been a recent work sponsored by government and led by Warwick Manufacturing Group looking at cross-modal safety assurance. This piece of work recommended that ODDs be developed for all modes of transport. The Future Flight ODD will help with the development of CONOPS and support future regulations such as predefined risk assessments and PDRAs and the SORA risk methodology that's being rolled out in the UK later on in next year. Moving on to the next standard. Many new entrants struggle to navigate the complexity of the management systems required. Many new entrants struggle to navigate the complexity of the management systems required and the assurance processes needed to demonstrate robustness, both as an organisation and also the technology and services that are being delivered. Also, large established aviation organisations have commented around the challenges of integrating innovation into the supply chain without new entrants being able to provide this level of assurance. So this standard will provide signposting to existing regulation, standards and management systems, bringing this together in one place so that it's easy to navigate and understand. And finally, we'll be delivering a research project on SORA. So SORA stands for Specific Operations Risk Assessment, and it's a risk assessment methodology for understanding and mitigating risks in a specific category of operations. SORA is currently deployed in Europe and it will be deployed in the UK next year. So SORA determines the risk levels and helps identify appropriate risk mitigations. SORA standards can be used as means of compliance for some of these areas of risk mitigation. In Europe, there's an existing and ongoing research to understand which standards can be used for means of compliance. In the UK, it's likely that there'll be localization of SORA, and this research project will define the implications this has on standards compared to the European adoption of SORA. So through the research project, we'll produce a research report providing guidance showing how standards can be used to support SORA in the UK. So I just wanted now to build on the beyond visual line of sight example that Nick gave earlier. So I think it's useful to look at how these 4 standards will practically support future flight. So looking at BV loss as one of the key challenges. So the vocabulary provides new definitions to clarify how we talk about BV loss operations. The ODD provides a consistent way of describing the BV loss operating environment within which this can be documented and used within a CONOPS. The guidance document will help people navigate the regulation and existing standards to be able to safely deliver BV loss operations. And then finally, the SORA research will inform how standards can be used as means of compliance to mitigate BV loss risks. So hopefully that kind of demonstrates the value of the 4 standards that we are delivering as part of the programme. Next slide, please. So there are several ways in which you can get involved in the standards development and also the Future Flight standards programme. We've actually got a web page which provides an overview of the programme, and links will be provided in the slide deck that's sent out after the webinar. The best way probably to get engaged in the programme is to first of all join the community hub and engage in some of the discussions online. We'll also be keeping people up to date about the programme and the standards that we're developing through the community hub. As I also mentioned, the standards landscape is also available via the community hub. The Future Flight Vocabulary Standard will be released later in the summer, and that will be going out for public consultation. So there's an opportunity to provide feedback on this standard. So again, if interested in doing that, please drop us an email, and we can keep you informed as to when that standard is being released. For the standards that we are about to kick off, the ODD standard and the management systems guidance, and also actually the research project, will be forming advisory groups around those 3 areas. So if you're interested in joining one of those advisory groups and informing and shaping the direction of those 3 areas, then again, please do get in touch. And then finally, Nick mentioned the ACE20 committees in his opening presentation. So ACE20 is a committee responsible for developing UAS standards for the UK, and always keen to talk to new potential members about joining the ACE20 committee. So again, please do get in touch if you're interested in finding out more information about ACE20. So thank you for listening, and look forward to answering questions on the panel shortly. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris. That was great. And yeah, Chris, I guess one of the takeaways from your presentation is this emphasis on understanding market needs and the regulatory landscape. So going back to this kind of mantra of the right standards at the right time, we need to think carefully about what could be helpful now and where more research is needed before we kind of jump in with standardization. So I think that's incredibly helpful. And as Chris said, please reach out to us regarding any of the advisory groups or committees that Chris has mentioned if they're of interest. I also just want to encourage people to remember to post their questions in the chat to us so we can get to them at the Q&A. I'm going to jump out of the agenda very briefly now before I hand over to our next speaker, Mike. Just to put a spotlight on some of the work we've been doing in a related domain, connected and automated vehicles, as hopefully this might be a useful illustration of how standards can support not only those emerging technologies, but also policy and regulatory development there. So if we could move on to the one more slide, please. And on to the next one, please. Thank you. So I think the format's thrown out a bit on this one, but that's absolutely fine. So yeah, looking at going back to what we've discussed today around TRL levels and emerging technologies and the role of standards there, we thought this would be helpful just to share as an illustration, as I've said, some of the work we've done in the connected and automated vehicles domain, which again, we're looking at not only autonomous technologies, but going back to one of Gary's previous points, how these vehicles will be integrated with traditional vehicles and other vehicles, and also, considering the infrastructure, considering power and fuel sources, etc. So hopefully it's not too much of a stretch. But one of the things that drew us into the conversation with government and other authorities around connected and automated vehicles was really the UK's desire, probably 4 or 5 years ago, actually, to start trialling this technology on public roads. So currently the regulation doesn't allow for full self-driving on any UK roads, as you probably know. but there is real opportunity through trials to understand the capabilities of the technology. BSI has been actively working in this area since 2019, working very closely with Government Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles, a part of DFT, and also with Innovate UK. And our work has really been focusing on working closely with organisations involved in the R&D projects, with the trialling, to understand what good looks like, to understand how we manage safety on the trials more effectively, building on existing work, policy work the government has done. And this kind of in turn has started to highlight, I guess, opportunities for good practice that not only support the industry, the perception of the industry, but also promotes confidence between the ecosystem. Again, going back to an earlier comment around the importance of understanding that ecosystem, we've found that the standards and good practices we've developed there through our PAS and Flex series has really helped to promote confidence between ADS developers, so autonomous driving system developers, from the software companies and the companies they're working with, like local authorities and wider. So the standard system series we've developed there is very much intended to support safety on trials and promote the safety first culture. But what's also happened in parallel is it started to identify some of the areas that standards could play an important role as we commercialise the technology, including topics such as looking at operational design domains, as Chris has mentioned, but in a road context, looking at how you might use vehicle data to support in-use monitoring and safety. We've also done work around topics like remote operators, and increasingly we're looking towards the likes of remote driving or teleoperation as a backup system, and what standards you would need there around the system requirements and the human factors. There's a lot of opportunities, I think, for read across and learning there. So if we can move on to the next slide, in terms of what this all means for BSI and for the UK. So our PAS series is out there, it's out there in the public domain. What we've been really intrigued by is a number of interested parties looking at the standards from outside the UK. So it's fantastic that these documents are being used to support trialling now on many trials in the UK, including recent trials such as CAF Forth, which is the autonomous bus trial up in Scotland. But also, we're really interested that over 50% of the downloads are coming from outside of the UK, which really shows thought leadership in the space, we feel. It's very much been driven through this consensus-based process, working with multiple stakeholders. And what we're doing is working, as I said, in kind of lockstep with CCAV, and also talking to the relevant agencies in that area to understand where standards can play a role and where regulation needs to take the lead, and how we kind of synergize those and avoid conflict. The other thing just to call out here is that two of our standards, and one in particular around the ODD concept, has now become the basis of a new ISO standard. So there's a new international standard based on one of the BSI PASs, and I think that really, again, just highlights this. These are universal challenges, and we need to take a domestic focus perhaps in the short term, but recognise it's a global landscape for standards and regulation outside. And so we really need to kind of look both domestically and internationally in any work we do on standards. And I think that's been a big part of Chris's work on the Future Flight Standards programme. So without further ado, I wanted to now to introduce Mike Gadd. So to help with our understanding of the SME perspective and also the regulatory environment a little bit more, I think Mike is really well placed to do that. Mike is currently, as I've said, head of the Office for Airworthiness at Blue Bear Research Systems, and also the chair of our committee covering drones and UAS. But Mike also spent over 20 years in regulatory roles with the CAA in the UK and the EASA. He was also chairman of ICAO's RPAS panel, So knows his way around standards, regulation, and how they can work together. So Mike, really keen to get your perspectives as someone who's worn those different hats as a regulator, working within SMEs and other industry bodies. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Nick. And I don't think I'm going to make too many surprises given excellent coverage we've had from the previous presenters. But from my view, the real key word is standardization. It's a common approach. It's a methodology that's going to help everybody to do things in a similar way, which makes everybody's life a little easier. So from an industry perspective, and I think it was Nick who mentioned earlier, most standards are a means to show that you are meeting a requirement, which is technically a means of compliance to a regulation. So they all fit together in a sort of pyramid structure that allow us to ensure that the regulated environment that aviation is can be met in a way that is consistent and as easy as possible for all of us. So for me, in the nascent industry where we've got lots of new technology, lots of new evolution, lots of new ideas, the regulations will typically need to be behind the curve because you can't regulate something you don't understand. But to get into service and do things and learn from that, but also from an industry perspective, actually having a commercial business needs a method of operating and doing, and ensuring that what you want to do and how you want to do it informs the regulatory process, and it becomes a closed loop function. There's a little bit of understanding what are the concerns, what are the intent of the regulators in their role to assure safety, build trust with the general public and consumers, and discharge their responsibilities. And we on the industry and the stakeholder side, finding the easiest, most cost-effective way to do that in line with our business needs. And for me, that's the nutshell of how the regulations and the standards are cohesive and symbiotic to help each other achieve what is in effect a commercial business that impacts small businesses, large businesses, nationally, and ultimately internationally. And so the framework of working together to understand what regulations we have, how they might need to adapt, where there might be gaps, and as we do that, how we are going to show that they can be met. We can evolve standards that will help us do that and make both the stakeholders who want to do things to be able to make that demonstration to a regulator, but also to ensure that the regulator has the knowledge and skills and processes and methods that they will need to receive that information and take it forward and grant the approvals or the permissions that they need to do under the regulations. I think the bit I would just finish on, and I'm just trying to recover some time back so we can have a really good question and answer session, is often the scope of standards are not totally recognized, because they can cover everything from a technical standard, which might be determining how waterproof something is, or how rainproof, or how temperature tolerant something is. And there's an element there of the standard can cover many different categories. And there's a conversation with the regulator to say what level is required for what type of equipment that is being used on an aircraft. You can then get from technical standards into processes and methods, and ISO, for example, the many management standards for quality and safety management systems are process standards, which many companies, not just in aviation, are able to use to show they have robust business practices. And then you can get into the more supportive things, and Chris mentioned earlier the SORA, and how do you carry out that risk assessment, and how do you show that you have adequately mitigated? So a standard way of doing things, showing things, what to consider, how you make those arguments, again, is a beneficial way of common approach that everybody can understand. So for me, it is an ecosystem that top down, bottom up, however you look at it, they support each other to enable a commercial industry to be successful, particularly within a regulated environment. And I'll leave it there. I'll hopefully gathered a little bit of time back, so we can have some questions later.
Thank you, Mike. That's great, and yeah, thanks for helping to get us back on track with the agenda. And I think, Mike, it's a really important point that you've raised there around highlighting the kind of spectrum or scope of standards, with the technical standards, process-oriented standards, and including management systems, those operational standards, all the way into risk assessment. And I guess naturally that might take us all the way through to people standards as well in some way, around competencies, which I think again we're seeing lots of areas where we can add value. So before we break into our Q&A, our final speaker is Nicola Bates. And Nicola, please join us. So for the future flight market to really take off, I think this is going to depend on the success of many of these early stage companies scaling and working collaboratively with the incumbent market and existing market. So I think Nicola is really well placed to talk about both of those things in both her role as a managing partner, Aerospace Accelerated, and head of global accelerators and innovation programs at Boeing. So has experience in all of this, and Nicola brings vast experience of international business development, fundraising for growth, strategy through to execution, and in her role as managing partner for Aerospace Accelerated, Nicola invests in and supports startups using AI and autonomous technologies, which I think is obviously a key facet of future flight technologies, as we said. So Nicola, please over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, so I think, great to hear from all the other speakers today, and hopefully I can give you a slightly different perspective on that too, in the sense that as Nick mentioned, we are in this new world and we're building a new industry here. And I think that one of the key things to that is really the commercial viability of that at the other end. So I genuinely believe that providing standards help us not only provide a level of confidence, but also an aiming point for innovators coming into the space. I think that we don't have enough innovators in this space. I think that is the reality of, when we look at the scale of the challenge that we have ahead of us. There are so many pieces of this puzzle that we need in order to make it successful. And as Gary pointed out earlier, there's a lot of this that we cannot write the plan for yet. We don't know. There's a lot of unknown unknowns still in this whole picture. So for me, this is really about how do we, as an ecosystem, as a community, attract more innovators into the ecosystem. And then in addition to that, how do we attract more investors into the ecosystem? Because in order for us to actually get this to scale and get this to the place that we want it to be, is going to take significantly more investment. And that's going to have to happen, in a fairly rapid order to meet some of those timelines that were laid out earlier. So we need more people, I think, is the message here. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to look around and think, where else can we pull from? And I think that example that we were given, from the autonomous ground vehicles is a great place. It's something that we looked at in the early stages of our accelerator program, was how do we find innovators in the automotive sector and can we pull them across into aerospace? In order to do that, there's a responsibility in all of us OEMs to actually help educate those innovators about what it takes to be successful in aviation or in aerospace. And again, that's where the standards and regulations help. However, there's also a large danger that they become restrictive. So I think that's where we have to, make sure that we really do have this open dialogue with that innovator community to make sure that we're not blindsided to restricting a market where we don't necessarily need to. So yes, by all means, we need to make sure that the safety element is there, but I think just as important is ensuring that we have the space in order for innovators to do what they do best, and safe places for us to try some of these technologies and some of these ideas that we've never even thought of, or technologies that have evolved, that have unlocked things that we previously didn't consider. So I think that should be an ongoing conversation, and that's where it's really important, that all of you all as innovators get involved in this conversation. Because it's very easy for all of us, speakers here today, to sit in our seats and have views and opinions. We know that we don't know everything. We know that we need that perspective from the other end, and also that perspective from the outside of aerospace. Because I think that those of us that have grown up in aviation and aerospace, we come with a bias like we do in any other area. And making sure that we continually keep that conversation open, to make sure that we're not missing something. And then, the piece of work that I do here at Boeing is really about building an ecosystem across the aerospace community internationally. So I think the other thing is, that we have to be mindful of the fact that, this is a global market. And as much as we need to focus domestically, to get things fixed at home first, I think that it's very important that we keep an eye on what's happening in that international space, and take those lessons, because there will be different geographies that do this differently. And very important, I think, that we make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes that are happening in other places, because that will help us actually accelerate the development of this ecosystem. I'm also very conscious of time, so I'm gonna stop there and leave plenty of time for the Q&A. If we don't get to any of your sort of investment questions that you need, please feel free to hit me up after this as well.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Nicola. Yeah, really, I think really critical point that, isn't it, really, around the need to balance the risks of standards not feeling like an impenetrable barrier to new entrants, with the role of standards helping those same companies to demonstrate their technologies are safe. And again, a really interesting point you made around, learning from not only other technologies and domains, but also what's going on in other markets, which I think feels really important. We'll move into the Q&A session now, and I'll ask all of our speakers to put their cameras on, if I may. Gary, I know you've had a few challenges with your technology, but it looks like you're back with us, which is great. And so, yeah, we've moved into the Q&A discussion. The plan is to run this discussion for about half an hour till around 11:30. We're just kind of getting back on time. Keep sending in questions. We'll try and get to as many as we can. What I'll do is I'll kind of pose a question to a member of the panel, but each of these questions welcome thoughts of all of our panelists on. So just to open with something to warm us up a little bit then, Gary, for you, and others, obviously, what do you think are the most exciting developments you are seeing in the sector at the moment in terms of use cases for the technology?
Looks like we might have lost Gary for a moment ago.
Okay. Does anyone else want to comment on that one, or what I can do?
Sorry,
is,
I can't hear you again now. Can you hear me at all? I've turned the camera off. I'll just check if that's coming.
We've got you back, Gary. You're back in the room. We can't see.
I'm sorry, I missed the question. If there was a question direct to me, I'll leave my camera off. I think the bandwidth in the in the engineering building at Birmingham is not great.
So Gary, we'll keep it brief. It was really to get your thoughts on what you're seeing as the kind of most exciting developments in the sector in terms of use cases for the technology.
Yeah, so maybe I'll do 4 really quick bullets and hope at least some of these come through. So number 1, I think there are 4 separate things going on. There's a load of tech development stuff. And by coincidence, I think if you look online this morning, you'll see that Vertical Aerospace have now flown untethered their aircraft and have published that. So the technical development, some really exciting aircraft stuff coming alongside air traffic management and so on. So we could list, there's no end of things we could list of technical development. But for me, the most exciting thing, if I'm honest, is that we're seeing people push into public demonstration. So if I go to the drone space instead, it's people doing real life demonstration of things that have societal importance. So the bit that gets the excitement, I think, is the bit that gets the public engaged in this, understanding the need, and frankly expressing some of their reservations as well. So having that real kind of public to aviation system conversation. So yeah, for me, it's all about the early use cases and the visibility of what we're trying to do.
Perfect. No, we got that loud and clear. Thanks, Gary. Excellent. And Mike, during your talk, you touched upon this role of standards supporting an emerging market and informing, I guess, regulation. There was a question around that. You know, how does that actually work? How can standards support the market while regulation is still being developed? But do you see that very much, as you said, kind of the learnings from trials and demonstrators beginning to inform regulation?
Yes, and I think Nicola picked up on it as well, but the fact that technology is being developed in lots of different domains, in lots of different sectors, and they're learning as much as we are as we go along. So picking up where they have already done things and bringing them into the aviation world is an accelerator. Learning lessons from other people is really what I'm coming down to, is something we cannot afford to miss. And that helps inform what is the art of the possible and what don't we know that aviation has not experienced before. For example, particular failure modes of certain sensors are used in the automotive world are being read across into the drone space. So how does that impact what we should be worried about, what we should be concerned about, and how do we manage that? So all of that learning from other sectors helps inform how we approach things. The standards that might be developed or being developed in those areas give us a good starting point, and they inform the regulator on what are the areas of concern that they need to consider. Because ultimately, regulations are about setting the boundaries of acceptability. They tell us what we can do, provided we can assure certain things in certain ways. So understanding those boundaries is a vital part of the regulatory development. And again, I think come back to Nicola, making sure they're fit for purpose, so they're not too constraining, they're not too restrictive. All comes from that sharing of information and knowledge.
Yeah, Nicola, did you want to comment on that one?
No, I mean, I'd agree, you know, wholeheartedly with all of that. And I think that, you know, it is in my mind as well, there's always this big play as well around not forgetting, how are we paying for this? We need to bring the financials with us. We need to bring those investors along with us and help, you know, understand, you know, even things like, you know, the return on investment cycle is very different in aerospace than it is in software. But some of these software companies are now in aerospace. So what does that look like? And how do we help them understand what those success metrics look like in our world? So I think there's a huge responsibility on all of us to get cleverer and get better at doing that as well.
Chris, I might bring you in now. Just, I don't know firstly if you have any thoughts on that piece around standards and regulation and how they work together to accelerate growth of the market, but equally also interested in your thoughts on what role the regulator plays in standards development itself.
Yeah. So I think a complete alignment with everything that Mike and Nicola has said. I think the thing that we need to recognise, there are 2 types of standards, I guess. Standards that support regulation in terms of we've talked about standards being used as means of compliance, but actually the vast majority of standards are not necessarily aligned, or dependent upon regulation. And so I think that gives us an opportunity. So the type of standard, I think you touched upon one, and it's the example I think we always tend to use is, is for example the EV toll charging. So it's probably unlikely that that's going to be regulated in terms of the type of end socket connector that's going to be used for that. But actually, it's going to be really important for industry to know that if you fly from one airfield to another, that you can recharge when you get to your destination. So actually, that type of standard is going to be really important in terms of harmonising, and creating interoperability within the sector. And that's something that can be done in parallel to regulation. So there are things that we can do to accelerate the sector, before the regulation actually sort of crystallises. I think the other point is, and I think Mike touched upon it. Standards is all about consensus building. So we can actually help standards inform the future of regulation, because actually that consensus building brings together industry and starts to align industry and build that consensus, that can then feed in to inform future regulation. So I think that's again another opportunity where standards can start to help fill gaps where regulation is being developed. In terms of the role that the regulator plays, so I think from my perspective, I think there are three areas. So I think the first area is sort of macro picture. So as we're developing our standards roadmap for the sector, we need to make sure that what we're defining in terms of the roadmap and the priorities within the roadmap align with the sort of future regulatory framework. And we're doing that by working with Department of Transport and the CAA to make sure that we're aligning the standards roadmap with the Future of Flight Action Plan. So I think that's really important, that engagement, to make sure that the standardisation plan is aligned with future regulation. I think as we're developing standards, particularly for the standards that are going to be used as means of compliance for regulation, I think it'd be really important to have a member of the CAA on the advisory group, contributing to the thinking of the development of the standard. And then I think the final piece is, once we've got standards that are relevant and applicable, I think it would be helpful for the regulator to be able to signpost in guidance material to those relevant standards, so that it's easy for industry to understand what standards can be used as means of compliance for certain aspects of regulation. So those are the three areas I think where the regulator could help.
Thank you, Chris. I'd like to bring Gary back in now, if I can. Gary, and you're still with us. You talked about the importance of a kind of people-based approach and understanding public perceptions. Do you see a particular role for standards there, and the standards work in building public confidence in technology?
Yes, absolutely, Nick. If I reference a piece of work we did with the University of Birmingham last year, we did a public dialogue. There's another significant piece of public dialogue going on, and really quickly, that's a heavy conversation with a group of people. It's not a poll of do you like drones or do you not like drones. It's a conversation. One of the most surprising things that came out of that, I'm not sure if we're surprised, is the public it understands some of the technology aspects here. So the types of aircraft we're talking about, they will be potentially much more intrusive in their operation. They'll have a set of technology, multiple sensors, including visual sensors, and it gets you into all these conversations around where do these things fly, how intrusive are they, what are the privacy concerns, and so on. So what came out from that is that the public is somewhat nervous about that. It has reservations about who is in control here as well. So if it is some of the perceptions of some of the technology companies, if it's those people, that makes them a little nervous. If it's sort of trusted bodies, it makes them more comfortable. So there's a really strong theme there that the public wishes to have, as I say, these trusted bodies. And one of the anecdotes I've referenced a few times is someone didn't understand the CAA existed, but said, I assume there's a regulator here. It's really important to us that regulators are involved. And a second thing there that we said is that they really wanted local authorities engaged as well. Now, why I reference regulator and local authorities, to me, they're in the same bucket, if you like, as people who are involved in setting some robust standards, being accountable, and frankly, being sort of publicly accountable as well. So yes, I think that the standards are part of that wider realm of local authority, regulation, and trusted bodies, and the public knowing that there is some level of control, and that may be the wrong word, some level of control and execution, and it's not a perceived technology Wild West. That's going to be really important in people trusting the technology.
And I think, Chris, we've already seen a good level of engagement from local authorities, haven't we, in the early stages of our standards programme? Yeah,
I was just going to sort of echo what Gary said there. So when I was at Connected Places Catapult, we carried out some research on, sort of similar type of stuff, Gary, that you're doing in a lot more detail now on Future Flight, and to get an initial understanding of public opinion. And again, one of the key findings from that was that the more people were sort of understood and were sort of informed, the greater the sort of trust and confidence in the technology and services. And the other thing that we found through that piece of work as well was that actually it's the organisation or individual that provides that messaging is also very important. So that level of being a trusted source. And I do think things like the British Standards kite mark and other types of marking like that, the public understand those types of sort of trusted organisations, and they know what those type of markings mean. So I think being able to explain to the public, they might not necessarily understand the regulation, but they might also might be easier to kind of explain in terms of some of the things that they see on a day-to-day basis, like the BS kite mark. So I think anything we can do to support that level of trust will be really helpful.
Thank you, Chris. Nicola, I was keen to just get your thoughts, and I'm asking you to generalize a little bit here, I suppose, but in terms of the early stage startup companies that you work with, is it possible to gauge, I guess, their awareness of standards? Where are they cognizant of standards? Do they have knowledge of how standards work? And also, I guess the second part of the question, do you think that standards can help them to demonstrate that the technologies are confidence? Are you seeing the opportunity for standards to help those businesses scale up?
Sure. So I think that if I'm really honest, it's a mixed bag in terms of those that are from the aerospace or aviation sector, and have a history in it and are, see the opportunity and are going after something. They absolutely are very aware. However, there's also a lot from coming in now from outside of that. And we are seeing a lot of new entrants into the industry, which is fantastic. And as I said before, we need more of them. So there is there's an onus on how do we make sure that we're helping upskill those that are new to the industry really quickly to make sure that we don't lose them to somewhere else. So I do think that is a key issue. But in terms of the benefit, I think from my perspective, again, it gives an aiming point for a lot of these companies, to get them going, and that when they're building from scratch, everything's ambiguous. So having something set that they can work towards, hugely helpful. It helps keep them focused and not go way off the piste, in the short and over the longer term. And then again, going back to the investor community, we get requests all of the time from a range of investors across the ecosystem to help them understand, does this make sense? Does this thing that someone has come and pitched them, is that possible? Can that become reality? So I think that the more that we can do, having signposting, for that investor community as well, to help them understand what the parameters are and what the likely timeframes are for this stuff as well, I think is super helpful, because what that does is provides confidence. And when you have confidence as an investor, you're obviously reducing your risk. And I think that that just means it makes our industry more investable, and being able to have those standards, being able to benchmark companies against that, because a lot of the time we get companies coming in and pitching us. You can have 10 companies pitching virtually the same thing. How do you decide which one? And having those standards to look to and say, okay, how close are they? Or how close are they to being able, because we get the question all the time, do you think this company would be able to get through certification? And we're talking about something that's maybe, 3 to 5 years away from that point. And those are the questions that they're asking. So the more certainty that we can create around what will it take, I think that just opens the market for more people to have confidence to come in to that space and help us meet some of the challenges that we have.
Thanks, Nicola. Yeah, and it chimes very much, Mike, with your earlier comments, doesn't it, around that kind of barometer, standards being a useful barometer in terms of how mature a business is, either their technology but also their wider business practices might be. I think often in my experience, we have two different conversations with startup businesses and scale up businesses. One is around what technology standards they need, what technical standards, and another very separate conversation around what standards investors or clients may expect them to have as a baseline. But Mike, that seems to chime in with your thoughts as well on that kind of broader package of standards.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I've got quite a couple, a handful of questions in the chat that I've pulled out, and we'll try and get to a couple of them before we wrap up. One of the questions here is around how will BSI kind of adopt or derive standards work going on through other standards bodies, and they use the example here that a lot of ISO standards can be quite conceptual in nature and not necessarily easy to use. And I think that's a fair challenge, and we see kind of gaps emerging for standards to provide something of an application layer really to make the standards more practicable. But Mike, is that something you're comfortable to come in on?
Briefly, yes. I mean, the objective is always to try and make the available standard, whether it's ISO or anybody else's, fit for purpose. So my first port of call is always to try to get that as comprehensive as possible. But no, absolutely, if nationally we find that there's a gap, then we should be considering how we fill that in the best possible way. And it might not be another standard, it might be pointing somewhere else, or it might be just providing some guidance. But if it's a gap, then yeah, we know about it, we can either take it back through the standards development process or look to do something nationally with BSI.
Thank you, Mike. And Chris, I think if I can bring you in on that, because I'm interested in a couple of minutes really, is the work that we've done on the landscape. What has that told us really about the state of play in terms of standards for future flight technologies? And we know that there's fragments emerging, but it's a landscape that still has lots of gaps, is my understanding.
Yeah, so if I could just sort of build upon what Mike said about the previous question, actually, just before we move on. So I think what we're trying to do through this program is certainly not kind of do a land grab for for all standards development. What we're trying to do is understand the landscape out there, and that's why if people go and have a look at the landscape we've produced, it includes content from all relevant SGOs working in aviation. So as Mike said, it's about getting the right standard for the for the right application, sort of right tool, right job. So I think the important thing here is not to actually duplicate effort. There's no point in the whole purpose of standardization is to get everybody sort of aligned and pointing in the same direction. So we don't want to create yet another standard on something similar. So what we actually want to do is pull together best of breed out there and present a lens on that for future flight, so that the organisations don't have to sort of navigate the complexity of multiple SDOs. And we'll be taking that similar approach as well when we do the roadmap, there'll be there'll be certain standards that Mike and the ACE20 committee are well placed to take forward where there are gaps within the roadmap, but also then there are other areas where other SDOs might be very much better placed to develop those standards. So what we want to do is work collaboratively across SDOs to to be able to get the right answer for the sector. So I think in terms of the sort of the second question, I'll just highlight a couple of the areas, based upon the feedback that we've had on the landscape. So I think we've touched upon it multiple times, sort of during the call today. So the next phase of the landscape, we want to start pulling in adjacent sectors and technology. So we've touched upon EV charging. Cyber security, for example, is another area where adjacent sectors where we can pull in relevant standards. One of the areas where I think we're going to do more work in terms of bringing in future flight is all very much driven by the environmental benefits of new forms of sustainable aviation. So we want to start to pull in standards activity around hydrogen and electric aircraft and the sort of broader ecosystem to support their operations. At the moment, the landscape just looks at published standards. We're looking at how we can start to build in standards that are in development, so that standards development can take, it's sort of measured typically in years, and so you want to be able to align with standards as they're being developed. So if we can provide information about standards in development, that will help the sector. And then I think final point, had some recent conversations with Ministry of Defence. I think there are some interesting standards from a military perspective where they're potentially ahead. So things like navigation systems and communication. And so, how can we learn from military, and potentially bring in some of their what they call STANAGs into the landscape as well. So that's kind of thoughts on where the landscape's going.
Thank you, Chris. There's a number of questions we won't get to today, and some of them are probably more regulatory themed questions about current state of play with regulation. There's a couple of questions around the kind of read across, I guess, between what we talked about in autonomous vehicles and what's happening in future flight, and what can we actually learn from the autonomous vehicle space that is helpful here. I think probably the thing I would pull out is this ODD concept, which, having just come back from a conference in the US with all the US Department for Transport, the federal state transport departments, and pretty much every company developing that technology, is that they all talked about ODD as being a way to clearly communicate your vehicle's capabilities with wider audiences as well as internally, and being a useful kind of translation device to do that. But the reason to do that is when you're thinking about safety, it's all about your vehicle's seems proportionate to your vehicle's operating domain and how you talk about that. In terms of read across into future flight and the future and the broader air mobility sector, the question goes on to use the example of drones versus regional air, which could have, I guess drones in an urban environment or regional air mobility might have quite different operating domains. But I think to me that shows the power of having a common way of talking about them, even though the operating domains might be different. So I think that might be one we can take offline, but I think what I'll do now is draw to a close because we're coming up to time. And I'd like to thank our speakers for their time this morning. Nicola, Mike, Gary and Chris. I know Gary's still with us in the ether somewhere, but it's really valuable contribution today, Gary and all of our speakers. So thanks for that. I mean, really helpful to learn from Gary about the Future Flight Standards program, Future Flight program, and how standards fit with that. And fascinating to hear from Mike and Nicola about what's going on in the sector in terms of innovation and this role and kind of balancing between innovation and supporting innovation and standards and regulation. I think some points I just want to pick out quickly before we wrap up. So from Gary's presentation, I think it's really helped to highlight that Future Flight is not trying to rehash old ideas. It's about trying to improve mobility and better connectivity and integration of airspace. And I think Gary really highlighted the fact that real world use cases are going to help bring this to life. And the breadth of that stakeholder ecosystem engagement is going to be key. And I think that this point that the technology is perhaps nearer than we think also really hit home. I think Chris, fantastic job of talking through the standards program, and I think the things that the takeaways there would be that you really highlighted the importance of consensus building from the start. So it's not just when we develop standards, it's why we're developing standards, getting some consensus around those, making sure we take account of the global landscape and do that in a robust way. Mike, you talked about regulations will need to be behind the curve and will naturally be behind the curve in some of these areas. And there's a big opportunity there for standards to support that learning, inform regulation along the way, and to provide that kind of common operating method. And we need to think about standards and regulation more symbiotically to support the emergence of the technology. And Nicola, last but not least, I think really helpful insights in what innovators think of the sector and of standards. And I think for me, the key takeaways there were that there is the potential to learn from other sectors. How do we unlock that? Because there could be huge benefit in doing that. How can we better inform or educate innovators around standards and regulation? Balancing that, as I said, balancing the risks of standards feeling impenetrable with the risks of the technology. So how do we position standards in this role of helping to enable safe innovation? They would be my key takeaways. I'm sure there's lots of others, but we hope we've been able to provide a useful introduction to the Future Flight Standards Programme as well. I'd also like to thank the audience for listening. I think we got up to nearly 150 attendees today, which is great. The slide we're on now, it should be the penultimate slide, will have some of the links that you can follow to find out more about the programme that Chris has already alluded to. And within the next few days, you'll receive both a copy of the slides and a recording of the event as well. So wanted to say thanks again to our speakers, thanks for joining, and goodbye, and we'll close the webinar now. Thanks very much.